C11. Find a boyfriend. Miss Jian? Cheng Mu's, however, glanced at Lian Cheng's retreating back before turning to Jian Yun. Are you okay? I'm fine. She forced a smile into her lips. The grip she had on her bag strap was so tight that the veins on the back of her hand bulged out. Even then, she didn't wince. Her bright eyes became glassy as her mother's words echoed at the back of her mind. Although it had always been like this, she still couldn't help but be affected by it all. Wu Wenjing, who had listened in on the entire conversation, placed her arm around her shoulder. Without another word, the three walked out of the restaurant. As they strolled down the pavements, Jian Yun saw Huo Liancheng leaning against the car from afar with a cigarette in his mouth. Despite the aloof expression on his face, he still attracted tons of passers-by, all desperate to get a better look at him. She could even spot a few women deliberately sizing him up without an inch of embarrassment in their actions. Mr. Cheng, she started, frowning. We can take a taxi back ourselves. You've already done so much for us. We don't want to trouble you any further. That's right. This place is closer to my home, so taking a taxi would be easy. Wu Wenjing immediately jumped in agreement. Although she was mesmerized by President Huo's good looks, even she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable by the man's cold demeanor. If Jian Yun was going to jump ship, the tension in the car might even be even more unbearable. Eye of Ku. He was about to agree until he heard the car door being slammed close. Upon looking up, Cheng Mu's caught sight of Lian Cheng's scowl and immediately changed his mind. Immediately, he waved his hands up in the air. It's really no trouble. Besides, getting a taxi this late at night might prove to be more troublesome. She exchanged a glance with her friend before nodding reluctantly. It would be hard to refuse a request from their boss. On the bright side, the night was coming to an end, and soon enough, they'd be parting their ways. Since Wu Wenjing wouldn't dare sit close to Liancheng, Jian Yun had no other choice but to sit between them, as usual. When she glanced at the man beside her, she could tell that he wasn't in a good mood. His eyes were closed, and his lips were set in a thin line. He looked as if he was having a headache. Not long after the car had driven off, her phone rang out. When she glanced at the screen, the corners of her lips quirked downward, and she had to suppress a sigh. Wu Wenjing peered closely. Is it Auntie? Nodding, she muted her phone and threw it into her bag, knowing fully well that hanging up on her mother would lead to even worse consequences. However, even as minutes had passed, she could see her phone still flashing every now and then, displaying around 20 missed calls. Jian Yun winced. God, she was going to get an earful after this stunt. You should answer, or else Auntie might. Wu Wenjing trailed off, but Yun already knew what her friend had wanted to say. Biting her lips, she squeezed her eyes shut as she readied herself for another round of her mother's lecture. She clicked the answer button, and immediately, her mother's hysterical screams shot through her eardrums. She winced. You, Mrs. Jian sputtered out. Is this how you treat your mother now? Are you already turning into your father? All of you, do you want me to just go into a hole and die? Ma, please. Jian Yun subconsciously glanced at Liancheng. Seeing that his eyes were still closed, she immediately lowered her voice and covered her phone. Her hand was shaking as she tried to soothe her mother's anxiety. I really had something to do earlier. That's why I wasn't able to answer. Mrs. Jian stopped screaming, but just before the young woman could celebrate the peace, she burst into tears. Do you know how many times that slut Lin Rong calls me up? She wailed. Not only had she stolen my husband, but her daughter also stole my daughter's boyfriend. Damn that family of homewreckers. Why am I such a failure? Why am I not dead yet? Does God really hate me that much? Mom, please I'll listen to you. How about that? Just give me the address, and I'll go on another blind date. Jian Yun could feel her knees buckling. She tugged the corners of the leather seat, sucking up all the air into her lungs. She'd go on 1,000 blind dates, if she had to. All that ever mattered was mitigating her mother's tantalizing temper. You have to promise me that you'll find a boyfriend 100 times better than that, Shu Haiyang, okay? She smiled bitterly. How could she even find such a man? It wasn't as if she could go into a store and order boyfriend 2.0. If only it were that easy. Shu Haiyang had been the man of her dreams, and now it seemed that he would forever be engraved into her dreams. Yun, the man you'll be meeting is Zhou Xiaolong. You'll meet him on the 3rd floor of Scorching Coffee Shop at 8 p.m. on Friday. Got it? Mrs. Jian reported the address in one go before reminding Jian Yun to be on her best behavior. Once everything had been settled, she hung up. Jian Yun felt her mouth had gone dry as she stared at the blank screen. It had always been like this. Her mother would panic and yell at her every time Lin Rong entered the picture, and she, being her daughter, had to follow every one of her biddings to calm her down. In fact, in this year alone, she had been on so many blind dates that she couldn't even count them all. The car ride had gone quiet, and no one said a word. Soon enough, they were already parked by the entrance of the residential complex. Jian Yun thanked Cheng Mu's before getting out of the car. She had originally wanted to thank Liancheng as well, but seeing that his eyes were still closed, she didn't bother to disturb him. Instead, she gave one last wave before turning to the gates. Worried for her friend, Wu Wenjing also got off the car and followed her. However, before the two could talk about the events that had transpired that night, Jianyun opened her phone and made another phone call. She pushed the door and headed into the living room. The call immediately connected, and an anxious voice sounded from the other end of the line. I was just about to call you. Auntie Chin, is my mother okay? She asked worriedly. Ah, if it wasn't for that woman, your mother would have been fine. We ran into her at the park today, and I tried to steer your mother away, but Lin Ron chased after us, and her words, they were just awful. Auntie Chin was her mother's cousin, and she had worked as a nurse before her retirement. After the accident, it was her uncle who had insisted that they come over to take care of Mrs. Jian, and she was beyond grateful for their assistance. Hearing this, Jianyun took a deep breath. The creases on her forehead reappeared as she sank into her sofa. She avoided Wu Wenjing's questioning stare before speaking. Have you already talked to my mom about moving to Qinghu City? Although that was ultimately the last resort, getting out of this city might be the only chance they had to get away from Lin Rong. The older woman sighed. You know how your mother is, Yun. Although she's sick, she's still as stubborn as a mule. Besides, your father, I don't even want to hear anything about him. She raised her voice, silencing Auntie Chin almost immediately. Fine. I won't say anything more. Don't worry about Lan, okay? Just take good care of yourself, she instructed. And please do as your mother had asked, okay? She's stressed and anxious. It's not the best time to get on her nerves. When she finally hung up, Jianyun was already burying herself under the sofa's cushions. She hugged her knees, bending over as if she had wanted to vomit. Although she didn't make a sound, her shoulders shook and her fingers trembled. Why did it always have to be like this? Yun, Wu Wenjing whispered, sitting beside her. Everything will be fine. You shouldn't worry too much. Jianyun shook her head. There were tears running down her cheeks, and her once bright eyes held so much darkness and resentment for her own father. It's been 6 years, and that bastard still controls our life. I hate him. I hate him. Although the two were roommates back at the university and were co-workers at Ming's, Wu Wenjing knew very little about Yun's family matters. Seeing as how secretive her friend had been about her past, she decided to leave it at that. In fact, today was the first time she had even brought up her father's name. Why don't you go take a shower first? I'll be staying over for the night. Wu Wenjing initially wanted to persuade Jianyun to come down, but she knew for a fact that her friend could be as stubborn as her mother. She waved her hand and pushed her towards the bathroom. Perhaps a warm bath can rid all those thoughts in her mind. When Jianyun finished, the redness in her eyes had grown faint, and the tear streaks had disappeared. Yet, her face still looked conflicted as 1,000 thoughts hounded at the back of her mind. Not wanting to think about it any further, she glanced at Wu Wenjing, who was too busy scanning over her phone with an infatuated look painted into her features. What are you looking at? She cocked up an eyebrow. What do you think? Wu Wenjing passed over the phone as if she was offering a treasure box. She leaned forward, reiterating all the pictures she had of their boss. Look at President Huo. God, he makes everything look 1,000 times better. C12, kneel down and sing Conquest. Jianyun stared at the screen, glancing at all the photos Wu Wenjing had secretly taken. Although they weren't very clear, it was obvious that the man in the frame was none other than Lian Cheng. Even his picture was enough to intimidate the onlookers. He's just not my type. She wrinkled her nose, pushing the phone away. Although she'd been interested in him at first glance, the man was far too aloof to hold a conversation. The guy's way too cold, and you should have seen him when he speaks. It's just outrageous. Before you could have a chance with him, you would have already died of frostbite. They had already met 3 times in a span of 2 days, and she knew for a fact that Huo Liancheng wasn't an easy man to get along with. Coupled with the fact of his status and good looks, he was already way out of her league. But you don't understand. Wu Wenjing crawled up to her bed and placed her hands over her face. She kicked her legs up in the air, and her eyes glistened. A man like President Huo is like watching a prize from afar, knowing its contents yet still not allowed to take it for yourself. But if you take him for yourself, just imagine the things that the man could do. He could probably buy an entire island for your honor. And imagine what he could do in the bedroom. Suddenly, the image of Liancheng sprawled across the sheets, with muscles out in display scoured through Jianyun's mind, and her cheeks immediately reddened. The hairs at the back of her neck stood up, and she immediately swatted her friend. Shut it. You speak as if you know him so well. Shaking her head, she grabbed a glass of water from her bedside table and took a sip. Although she knew that Wu Wenjing was only saying this to divert her attention, she couldn't help but think of all the events that had transpired from last night. Yesterday, Wu Yanyan had just told her how Lin Lanlan was back in town. Today, Lin Ron had gone through great lengths just to provoke her mother. It seemed that they were brewing something, one that she didn't want to be a part of. Oh yeah? You still haven't told me how you met President Huo? Wu Wenjing snapped her fingers as the thought occurred to her. You were talking about how cold he is, and how he speaks. You even have his coat in the wash. Are you enemies or something? Enemies? No, I just met him. She sighed, flinging a magazine at her head. The last thing she wanted to talk about was that jerk. This time, Wu Wenjing jumped up and dodged the magazine. Without even bothering to hesitate, she tickled her sides. Jian Yun laughed out loud until she was out of breath. Giving up, she finally told her friend everything that had happened the night before. Once she was finished, Wu Wenjing's jaw dropped. It took her a few seconds to recover before she sighed and shook her head. I really didn't think you'd have such bad luck on these blind dates, she murmured. But somehow, I feel like President Huo seems interested in you. Jian Yun had been drinking water this entire time. Upon hearing her words, she spat right on her face before bursting into laughter. Wu Wenjing glared at her resentfully. I'm sorry. Yet she looked far from apologetic. Clutching her sides, she bent over as a few chuckles slipped her lips. It's just what you've said. It's so ridiculous that it's funny. You're impossible. She stomped back into the bathroom. Not long after, she headed back into the room and glared at her. I'm being serious here. And I'm usually right. Besides, I saw the way he acted around you, and it's far different from all the other women in the office. He obviously doesn't see you as just another employee. Jian Yun stared at her, speechless. I think you're forgetting the fact that we've just met yesterday, and the fact that I've insulted him right in his face. Bet he treats me as his enemy, rather than his coworker. Don't you believe in love at first sight? Love at first sight. At the sound of that, she rolled her eyes and giggled. This was already getting even more preposterous by the day. You want to tell me that President Huo, one of the richest men alive, would fall in love with an ordinary employee like me? Wu Wenjing nodded seriously. God, you're hopeless. She threw her a pillow. Do you really think this is some kind of Cinderella story? Should I be expecting a glass slipper now? A fairy godmother, perhaps? Just forget it. Wu Wenjing collapsed back onto the bed, grabbing the pillow. Although their statuses were different, she believed that love knew no borders. Guo Liancheng could be the richest man on the planet, and Cupid's arrow couldn't care less. Besides, she wasn't blind. The 2 times Jian Yun had fallen onto Guo Liancheng's lap back at the car, she could see how focused the man had been in gazing down at her. They acted as if they were the only ones in the world, and it was that sight that could make any woman swoon in jealousy. In this world, absolutely nothing is impossible, especially when it came to love. The skies had gradually darkened, and silence ensued. Wu Wenjing had already fallen asleep, leaving Jian Yun alone to stare up at the ceiling. Various memories rushed into her mind as she chewed on her bottom lip. Her childhood was probably one of the best times in her life. Her mother was a middle school teacher, and her father was a businessman. Although her family was as prominent as Liancheng's, she didn't have to worry about food or clothes. For many, she was a little girl living her own fairy tale. However, when she was 21 years old, she realized that even such fairy tales, no matter how bright, could be taken away from her with a single blow. When Lin Lanlan, her best friend for more than 10 years, admitted to being pregnant with Xu Haiyan's child, it felt as if her entire world had collapsed all around her. She remembered the tears rushing down her cheeks as she mustered up the courage to even speak. This was the same woman with whom she had shared her curry, the same woman whom she had treated like family, and she had already turned her back on her. Not only was Lin Lanlan the daughter of the woman who had wrecked her fairy tale into 2, but she also held a major part in actually tearing her life apart. It seemed that her life was like one of those reality show reruns. As Jian Yun was about to fall asleep, she heard 2 clicks from the door, followed by a pair of footsteps. No. Afraid that she would wake Wu Wenjing up, she hurriedly left the bedroom to greet her friend. Luo Yanyan peered into the bedroom. Wu Wenjing's here? Yeah. We went out to eat, and by the time we were done, it was already late. A bitter smile threaded across her lips. Well, that was the watered-down truth. However, upon seeing the look on her friend's face, Jian Yun frowned. Is something wrong? Luo Yanyan looked as if she wanted to say something else, but later changed her mind. She rubbed the back of her neck. I was wondering if you'd lend me $3,000, she murmured nervously. I promise I'll pay you back next month. You don't have to explain it to me. Give me a second. Jian Yun grabbed a hold of her phone and opened one of her apps. I don't have the cash on me, so is it okay if I transfer it to you? That's fine with me, Luo Yan nodded vigorously. When the amount was deposited, the nervousness in her features had vanished. Instead, an unsettled glint appeared in her eyes. Thank you so much, Yun. I swear I'll pay you back. It's nothing. Jian Yun wanted to ask her why she needed the money until she remembered that Luo Yanyan's mother and brother had visited earlier. Of course, knowing them, they must have drained her wallet empty. If it weren't for those leeches, how could Luo Yanyan, as strong and prideful as she was, ask for money? Jian Yun shook her head in disbelief. Ever since they were university students, she had always seen her friends struggling to make ends meet, both for her tuition and her family's endless wants. As she watched Luo Yanyan retreat in her bedroom, she leaned back against the wall. There were just some problems where she had to deal with herself. These were unthreaded waters, one that wouldn't always be as smooth sailing as one might wish. Jian Yun stared out the window as a melancholy smile made its way to her lips. No matter how miserable she felt, there were other people who had it worse than her. and she could only wish that all of them could wave through these murderous waves. C13. It is easy to meet your enemy. When Jianyun and Wu Wenjing were about to leave for work, Luo Yanyan had already left. Usually, as the days approached the weekend, their schedules would have been less hectic. However, as the HR department was meeting their new manager, all of them had to go to work early and go over all the extra documents. By 9, Li Shangrong had arrived with a few people trailing behind him. He glanced over at all his subordinates before clapping, attracting everyone's attention. Immediately, all of them stood up in unison to greet their new boss. In the middle of the room stood a well-dressed woman. Her soft makeup highlighted the glow in her face, making her seem even younger and more beautiful. In fact, from afar, she looked just like Fan Bingbing, a popular Chinese actress. However, her soft features didn't hide the aggression in her eyes. There was something about her beauty that made her all the more domineering, intimidating even the men in the room. As Jianyun looked at the woman, a chill raced down her spine. Wasn't this the crazy woman who had chased her after Huo Liancheng? Wasn't she the one who had wailed out about the man abandoning her? That crazy woman was going to be their HR manager? She resisted the urge to groan at her sheer luck. It seemed that Liancheng wasn't going to be her only nemesis in the office. At this point, it was like the universe was already colluding against her. Everybody, I want you to meet your new manager, Ms. Xia Bingbing. Please give her a warm welcome. She even had the same name as the actress. Applause rang across the hall. As usual, Xia Bingbing started off with an opening statement, followed by a couple of orders on how things should go. She had only just been here a couple of minutes, but the way she spoke made it seem as if she had been here for years. Her voice was overbearing and tinged with arrogance that even the senior staff secretly frowned at the sight. Wu Wenjing used this time to whisper in her ear, "Yun, look at her bag. Hermes. It must have cost thousands of yuan, and did you see the skirt she's wearing? It's Fan Sijie's newest design. I saw it in the store the other day, and it's worth half a year's salary to even buy one right off the bat. Manager Xia must be loaded." The last thing Jianyun wanted to pay attention to was Xia Bingbing's fashion choice. The only hope she could hold on to was that she wouldn't recognize her. After all, she had been wearing heavy makeup the other night. Plus, why the hell did that woman have to look so beautiful? Couldn't she have been ugly to match her already rotting soul? I don't like it when people don't pay attention while I'm talking. Suddenly, Xia Bingbing's voice sounded. Everyone had gone silent as her strict gaze fell on the tall woman at the back of the room. She raised her eyebrows. "Do you have any objections to what I've just said?" Wu Wenjing didn't realize who she was talking about until the woman had walked towards her. She pointed at herself. "Manager Xia, are you talking about me? Is there any other person talking around here?" Her eyes flashed in disdain. "What do you mean? Aren't you a person?" Wu Wenjing replied sarcastically. Coming from Sichuan, she was used to the rowdy atmosphere, and there was no way she was going to allow herself to be stomped on. Her fingers dug into her palm, clenching her jaw. Perhaps Xia Bingbing wasn't used to people talking to her that way, because she immediately exploded in rage. Her cheeks were flushed white as her fingers trembled. "You!" she sputtered out. "You dare talk to me like this? Do you even know who I am? You could be the president's daughter and I still wouldn't care. You're the one who humiliated me first." She rolled her eyes. "You think I won't fire you for your misdemeanor? I've already signed a contract with Ming's, and it still hasn't expired yet." Wu Wenjing blinked, placing a hand to her sides. "You can fire me all right, and the next time you'll see me, it would be at court." Li Shangrong immediately came to the rescue, waving her hands between the two women. He shook his head. All right, he started, trying to make his voice as joyous as possible. "Manager Xia only said those words for your own good. Calm down." He even shot Jianyun a helpless look on his face. Immediately, she held her friend back. "Stop talking." Although she didn't like the way Xia Bingbing had spoken to them, she didn't want to put more trouble on her plate. Besides, her arm was already sore from covering and scratching the sides of her face. Jianyun gritted her teeth. However, she couldn't just stand there and allow the two to continue fighting like this. After all, they would all have to work together in the future, and Xia Bingbing was already assigned to be their manager. If her friend had offended her, Manager Xia would definitely stop at nothing in making both their lives a living hell. Wu Wenjing must have thought the same thing, as she immediately quieted down. Xia Bingbing glared at her once more and turned to leave. However, just before she turned, she glanced at Jianyun as if trying to size her up. Suddenly, recognition flashed in her eyes, but she hesitated. "You look familiar. Have we met?" Jianyun immediately shook her head. "No, if I knew someone as beautiful and noble as Manager Xia, I wouldn't have forgotten," she insisted. The woman must have enjoyed the compliments, because she had nodded and allowed Li Shangrong to lead her into the manager's office. Their dispute had already come to an end. Everyone finally dispersed to finish their own tasks. As soon as Jianyun sat down, she received a message from her WeChat. "Call me. Yun. Do you know this bitch? She's the crazy woman I was talking about, the one who splashed the coffee on me. It's better not to bother her. I remembered her saying that she was pregnant with President Huo's child. What the hell did you just say? Pregnant? Suddenly, Jianyun heard a noise from the other desks. When she turned, she saw that Wu Wenjing had already fallen off her chair. Suppressing a giggle, she returned to her work. After this incident, Xia Bingbing must have already busied herself with all the handover processions, because she still hadn't made her second appearance after the opening statement. However, as Jianyun and Wu Wenjing were walking out of the staff dining room, they spotted Huo Liancheng striding across the elevator while their new manager raced after them with her 10-centimeter heels. Liancheng, wait for me. Xia Bingbing's previously overbearing appearance had changed. Instead, her eyes flashed with urgency and her features had softened almost entirely. It was like looking at a completely different person. However, President Huo continued, acting as if he hadn't heard her. He didn't even bother to look at her as he passed the two of them. They quickly lowered their heads in greeting. President Huo? Huo Liancheng pretended not to have heard them either, as he quickly overstepped and changed direction. Knowing fully well that this was how he acted, Jianyun didn't even bother to react. Xia Bingbing only had eyes on the man that she didn't even notice the two as she passed by. Once the strange couple was out of sight, Wu Wenjing nudged her in the arm, staring at the woman's high heels. I've never seen a pregnant woman trying to run in heels, she murmured. Gotta say, I admire her. Lower your voice. Jianyun pulled her friend's arm and dragged her away. The last thing she needed was to have Manager Xia recognize her. It was better off like this. Furthermore, she had already punched Xia Bingbing back then. Although the punch wasn't as hard and was just enough to throw her off, it would definitely put a dent between them. Even then, Jianyun couldn't help but furrow her eyebrows at the sight she had just witnessed. From the looks of things, Xia Bingbing had obviously fallen deeply in love with Huo Liancheng. She may not know what conflicts they had, but how could they have been so careless at such an early stage of pregnancy? Liancheng didn't even glance her way. Did he really not care? It was strange. They quickly walked towards the elevator on the other side of the corridor, not noticing that Huo Liancheng was still in earshot. I just don't get why Xia Bingbing's still wearing heels at this stage, Wu Wenjing commented, and the man stopped in his tracks. C14. I'm not interested in General Manager. Huo Liancheng, stop right there. When Xia Bingbing saw that the man had no intention of responding to her, she stomped her feet in anger. From the sudden movement, she immediately clutched her shoulder in pain. Ak! At first, she had thought that she wouldn't be able to catch up with Liancheng anymore. However, to her surprise, he had unhesitatingly turned towards her. He cocked an eyebrow up in the air. Is something wrong? Although she was stunned for a moment, she quickly recovered. Fluttering her eyelashes, a slow smile spread across her lips. So you do care for me? She exclaimed in ecstasy as if she had just won a lottery. The two women, who were waiting for the elevator, shivered at the sound of their manager's flirtatious voice. Even Jianyun had to stifle a laugh. Although Huo Liancheng didn't look directly at Jianyun, he could see her from the corner of his eyes. He didn't miss the subtle act, and an unknown feeling stirred in his heart. Turning away, he glanced at the woman clinging onto him like a koala. Liancheng. Xia Bingbing clung her arms around his body, desperately trying to catch his attention once more. My shoulder hurts so much. It's because of that ugly woman back at the coffee shop the other night. After she punched me, I've always been in pain. Although Liancheng kept his distance, Jianyun, who was facing the other way, couldn't have known. As she heard their manager's high-pitched voice, the hairs at the back of her neck stood. The smile on her face faded. Were they flirting? She originally wanted to turn around and see how the two were flirting in such a crowded place, but upon hearing Xia Bingbing's words, she froze. Afraid that the man would suddenly point his finger at her and inform his girlfriend as to who the culprit was, she grabbed a hold of Wu Wenjing. Let's go, she whispered urgently. As if the heavens had heard her prayers, the elevator door opened, just in time. The two of them jumped in, and she quickly slammed her finger onto one of the buttons. Yun. Wu Wenjing furrowed her eyebrows, surprised by the sudden movements. What are you doing? Are we being chased by a dog or something? A rabid dog is more like it. Jianyun snorted, staring at their manager's coquettish act. As the elevator doors were about to close, a thought suddenly occurred to her. Her skin prickled from the heat as she felt an itch in her lower spine. Feeling as if someone was staring at her, she slowly looked up, only to meet Liancheng's gaze once more. His eyes were even more piercing than last night. It was as if he was scouring through her very being, wanting nothing more than to suck her back into his grasps. At the sight, her heart started pounding wildly. They had only stared at each other for a second, but Jianyun felt as if it had lasted an eternity. The back of her hands started to sweat as a weird ball rose up to her throat. Soon enough, her thoughts were interrupted by a soft ding as the elevator doors closed in front of her. What are you thinking about? Seeing that her friend wasn't listening to her, Wu Wenjing slapped her on the arm. Nothing. She could only lower her head. What the hell was wrong with her? How could such a perfect man like President Huo fall for someone like her? She obviously had a facelift and a nose job, and you've seen how she acts. How could she be pregnant with his child? Ugh! Is he blind or something? Wu Wenjing rolled her eyes exasperatedly, throwing her hands up in the air. Suddenly she hesitated and turned to her friend. But Yun, I still think that President Huo likes you, you know? I mean, you did say that. Don't. Jian Yun pressed her hand against her forehead, not wanting to hear anything more. They had already gone over this last night, and as much as she tried to reject the woman's claims, her friend just kept on talking. 6. No, listen to me, she insisted. For a rich and handsome man like President Huo, he probably has tons of women surrounding him. Maybe he wants to include you in his harem. Stop it. Besides, you've already said he had a bunch of women. What do you think I'll add to the group? Wu Wenjing blinked, staring at her friend as if she had grown 2 heads. Have you seen yourself? You look so much prettier than that Bint Sha Bingbing. If I were a man, I would have dropped her like a hot potato and sleep with you instead. Jian Yun wanted to retort, but they had finally reached the 22nd floor of the HR department. Although there weren't many of their co-workers around the area since it was lunch break, they weren't newcomers. Even walls had ears, especially in a department as bustling as this one. Naturally, the topic had been dropped. She slowly steadied herself and reached her seat, praying that all this drama would end here. However, all her worries were slowly coming to life. Right after the lunch break, she was called into the manager's office, and just as she had entered, a folder came flying towards her. Jian Yun dodged it quickly, and when she turned back, she saw Xia Bingbing sitting behind her desks with a murderous glint in her eyes. Had Lian Cheng told her about what she had done? Her arms stiffened to her sides as she prepared herself for the worst-case scenario. God, couldn't the fates be on her side for once? Manager Xia? She uttered. You're Jian Yun, right? Xia Bingbing flung another document at her, cursing under her breath. Her eyes flashed dangerously. I wasn't aware that Mings would accept trash employees. Aren't you the one in charge of this document? Well, you can't even spot an obvious error. Are you blind? Struggling to calm herself, Jian Yun walked over and scanned the document in her hands. There was red ink encircled across the words that were claimed to be wrong, but after looking at them closely, all of them were judged by pretense. She scowled. She had always been serious when it came to her work, so there was no possibility for error on her part. Manager Xia, the document isn't. Xia Bingbing slammed her hand against the table, clenching her jaw. The softness in her features had receded, and instead, Jian Yun started to flashes of the rabid woman she had met back at the coffee shop. I'm your manager, so I'm just gonna say this once, she snapped, sneering. Don't think that President Huo is interested in you. You got that? There are thousands of others who want to climb into his bed, and all of them haven't succeeded. What makes you so special that you'd have the nerve to dream so high? So you want to set me up? Jian Yun narrowed her eyes. It seemed that the problem wasn't actually in the documents. I'm simply reminding you of where you stand. Xia Bingbing gazed up at her, eyes glittering in disdain. He's out of your league, and if you keep getting yourself acquainted with him, you might as well start listing ways on how to die. What you've said makes a lot of sense. She held herself calmly, as if unaffected by the manager's words. Well, it seems you're not that stupid after all. Nodding in satisfaction, she leaned back against her seat. You can leave then. Kobayashi with hidden disease. Ever since Cheng Mu's had proudly announced that Lian Cheng had taken a fancy to a woman in the office and sent in another dim photo from the evening, he deliberately ignored their calls and messages. Tonight, after his shift, he finally had the opportunity to talk to them. The corners of his lips quirked up as he got rid of the airplane mode. Immediately, his phone blew up. His phone rang for a good 10 minutes, and before that, he saw hundreds of missed calls and text messages. As he scanned through them, he saw that his friends weren't too pleased with his little stunt, given that all the messages he had received were filled with curses and pleas that could give an old man a heart attack. Snorting, he placed his phone back on his desk and headed into the bathroom. Once he was finished with his shower, Cheng Muzi wrapped himself with a towel and held a glass of red wine. Logging into his WeChat, he scrolled over to the group chat and noticed that the first 200 notifications were filled with stickers and exclamation points, as they all begged for him to know exactly the beauty who had moved Lian Cheng's heart. An evil smirk slid into his features as he shared with them another gossip that had spread across Ming's enterprise. Stop asking who that girl is anymore, he typed. Sister Jian already announced that she had no interest in a man like Mr. Huo. After the message was sent, he added a sticker of a man kneeling on the ground with tears flowing down its face. Once the news came out, the group chat erupted into another uproar once more. The group members quickly jumped from their seats as they wailed out in pain for their fallen brother. With Fourth Bro's looks and charm, how could any woman reject him? I don't believe it for a second. He's practically loaded with cash, and he doesn't look half bad either. She must be blind, is she? But then again, she's quite brave for even saying such daring words to our Fourth Bro. Oh, he had finally fallen in love with a woman who couldn't love him back. Fourth Bro, I'm here for you. I'll comfort you. Ha! Get away. He's mine, mine. Soon enough, everyone was already debating why such a simple woman would reject the likes of Huo Liancheng. A few had stated how there was probably something wrong with Sister John's eyesight. The others have assumed that she didn't like his cold and unflattering personality, and the next thing they knew, they were already discussing whether there was something wrong with their fourth brother, given that they still hadn't seen him with a woman for all the years they had been with him. Cheng moos, yo, tell me, is fourth bro gay? Does that mean I have a chance? Cheng Muze grinned as he took a sip from his glass. Even if he's gay, it's not your turn. It's mine. My secret crush on him would finally come to life. Is that so? Immediately, another message popped up. Taking a deep breath, he felt the rich fragrance of the wine entering his nostrils. It was as if his movements had slowed down as his head felt light on his shoulders. Unwinding after a long day was truly gratifying. When he spotted the message, he quickly answered, "Of course." All of a sudden, a bad feeling stirred in his stomach. Why was the group suddenly so quiet? Cheng Muse glanced at his phone, and his relaxed and calm expression ultimately collapsed. His eyebrows knitted together as his heart skipped a beat. His fingers trembled as he typed the next few words. He was done. "Fourth bro, you're here. If I didn't go online, how could I have known you have a crush on me?" Even if he was just reading them through the screen, Cheng Muse could see the murderous intent wafting from Huo Liancheng's words. Suddenly, the wine he had been drinking didn't seem so good anymore. "Cheng Muse, I'm giving you 10 minutes to appear in my office." Then, Huo Liancheng tagged everyone in the chat, "And nothing's wrong with me. If you'd like, you could confront me with them one by one." Silence had coursed through the group chat. A few seconds ago, the band of brothers was loud and jubilant as they had gone through assumption after assumption, but now it was as if everyone had suddenly passed out. Cheng Muse cursed under his breath. So much for brotherhood. After sending the last message, Huo Liancheng logged off from his phone and didn't say anything else. With a sigh, the man adjusted his glasses and put on his suit before dragging himself to the office. The next day, Jianyun came by early on purpose. As she stood alone in the lobby waiting for an elevator, a shout echoed across the hall. "Sister Jian! Sister Jian!" When she turned around, she saw that it was none other than Cheng Muse. He twirled a packaged breakfast in his fingertips, and a small smile spread across her lips. Not refusing, she grabbed the package and thanked him. "You're a lifesaver." However, when she looked up, she noticed another person standing beside the young man. His intimidating presence wafted around her, rendering her out of breath. Immediately, the smile on her face froze, and she lowered her head. President Huo. The awkwardness in the room had doubled, and Cheng Muse had to suppress a laugh. He glanced at Huo Liancheng, only to see that the man's indifferent features had become colder by the second. "Assistant Cheng, didn't you sleep last night? You look like a raccoon." The elevator hadn't arrived yet, so Jianyun took the time to observe his haggard looks. He looked as if he had just gotten out of bed. We were tossed about by our boss most of the night, so we're exhausted." Cheng Muse yawned, rubbing his eyes. After fourth bro had called on him in the office, he had been assigned with so much paperwork that they practically towered all around him. As the memory surged through him, he couldn't help but shudder. That was definitely one of the worst nights of his life. Jianyun pursed her lips and subconsciously glanced up at Huo Liancheng. That was exactly what Cheng Muse wanted. His smile became even more mischievous. "And hey, I already told you to drop the formalities, didn't I?" His eyes glinted. "I'm calling you Sister Jian now, so why don't you call me Brother Z? You're acting as if we're shooting the Legend of the Condor heroes." Jianyun wrinkled her nose as she swatted his arm away. After seeing his disheveled figure, she found herself more comfortable at his presence. "Are we heading to the palace now?" "Fine. How about this then? Since I'm usually called fifth amongst my friends, why don't you call me fifth bro instead?" he said in a tone that didn't allow any rejection. "Do you want to go or not?" Huo Liancheng interrupted their conversation. Only then did she notice that the elevator doors had already opened. When she looked up, she saw that Liancheng had already gone inside and was staring at her impatiently. She hurried into the elevator and suddenly felt that things weren't right. Why was he in the staff's elevator? Shouldn't he be in the exclusive one? "Sister Jian, you haven't answered me yet." Cheng Muse whined like a little child. He was just about to go in when he noticed Liancheng's narrowed gaze. Immediately, he retracted his foot as if he had been burnt. "Aren't you joining us?" Seeing that the elevator door was about to close, Jianyun pressed on the button to open it once more. She furrowed her eyebrows when she saw hesitance grazing his features. Cheng Muse glanced at Liancheng's hardened face. Remembering his miserable experience last night, he gulped. The last thing he wanted to do was tug at the man's whiskers again, so he waved his hand dismissively. I actually need to go to the washroom," he murmured. "You go on right ahead." Jianyun blinked in surprise, but before she could say anything, the elevator door had already closed. She stilled. Although she didn't want to be stuck in the same room as President Huo, it wasn't as if she could do anything about it. It would be far too deliberate if she walked right out of the elevator. Forget it. Besides, it was just a few floors till she arrived at the HR department. She could just avoid him more in the future. Chapter 16, Elevator Shock. Jianyun hated enclosed spaces. The mere thought of walls looming over her like a packaged box would send chills down her spine. It It didn't help that Huo Liancheng was standing right beside her. His intimidating presence was enough to make her want to vomit. She tried her best to stand far away from the man the moment he had entered with her, and now, both of them stood in opposite corners of the elevator. Jian Yun had lowered her head, so she didn't notice that Liancheng was gazing at her reflection, using the mirror wall beside him. She was wearing a white buttoned-up shirt and a pencil skirt. On top of it was a caramel coat that hugged her figure in all the right places. Her dark, flowy hair fell onto her back in curls, framing her heart-shaped face perfectly. Although her makeup was simple, it held a certain elegance and innocence that could send any man running after her. She tucked a hair behind her ear. After Liancheng had taken her glasses, she went ahead to get a new pair, but she didn't wear them today. From his viewpoint, he could see her soft features and bright eyes. Her beautiful cherry-red lips were enough to send any man to his knees, and the way her eyelashes fluttered made his heart lurch. She had the face of an angel, and it was a face that had haunted his dreams countless of times. Jian Yun had never been the type to jump to conclusions, but she had noticed that Liancheng had been staring at her this entire time. He was far from the sarcastic and harsh man she had met the other night, but even then, she continued to ignore him. This wasn't the time to think too much into it. After all, with Manager Xia looking at her every move, it was best that they don't communicate any further. Maybe she had really gone to work, albeit too early today. As the numbers gradually rose even higher, she could feel the hairs of her neck standing up. Why was it so slow? Her wrists shook in impatience. All she ever wanted was to get as far away from this man as possible. Finally, the elevator had stopped moving. As she was readying to rush out, a hand shot behind her and pulled her back. Her eyes widened momentarily as she tried to register what was happening. "Hey," she sputtered out, struggling out of his hold. "What are you?" However, before she could finish, the elevator shook a little. The lights around them had gone out, and it was soon followed by a sudden crash. Her back slammed against the wall from the impact, and the hard metal grazed across her hips. Pain coursed through her system. It took her a few seconds to realize what was happening, and she belted out a loud scream. Her heart continuously throbbed in panic as she waved her arms up in the air, struggling to find something to hold on to. Her stomach twisted and turned, and the sudden urge to vomit came back in full force. "Lean you back against the wall and squat down," Huo Liancheng whispered in her ear and wrapped her arm around her sides, steadying her. This wasn't the first time she had encountered an incident like this one. The accident from 6 years ago had left her traumatized and shaken. Immediately, the memories rushed back through her like a colliding truck as images of the tragedy popped into her mind. So many people had died. If it hadn't been for Liancheng, she would have been frozen in fear as she awaited her fate. She couldn't die today. She still had her mother counting on her. Finally, as if God had listened to her prayers, the elevator halted. The emergency lights flashed for a bit before going out once more. The sense of urgency had left and she collapsed onto the floor, panting heavily. Her legs had grown wobbly from the incident and she could feel her throat burning up. Safe, she was safe. "Are you okay?" Concern laced his voice, leaning beside her. She shook her head in reply. Suddenly remembering that it was dark and that they couldn't see a thing, she later whispered, I'm fine." "Did you bring your phone?" he asked. "Give it to me. I'll make a phone call." Not thinking too much into it, Jinyan grabbed the phone in her bag and handed it to the shadowed man at the other corner of the room. Her hands were still trembling from the impact. She took a series of deep breaths. The last thing she needed was to go into an all-out panic attack. Her phone lit up. Under the dim lighting, she could see him making a phone call. Although he wasn't on speaker mode, she heard the person on the other end of the line promising to be there immediately. She heaved a sigh of relief as she slowly staggered up, leaning against the wall for support. After hanging up, he didn't return the phone immediately. Instead, he pressed another set of numbers onto the screen. Once he pressed the call button, she could hear his own phone ringing in his pockets. Her eyebrows furrowed over. But before she could ask him about it, he had already saved the number and handed it back to her. "That's my number," he stated. Jian Yun gazed at his name embedded in her screen and furrowed her eyebrows. Why? He had clearly brought his phone, yet he used hers to make the call. Was it because he wanted to get her number? Jian Yun knew for a fact that she was attractive. Ever since she was young, she had met a fair share of men who would do anything to woo her over. However, Liancheng was on a different level. With his aristocratic background and devastatingly good looks, how could he find her interesting? Especially when he had the likes of Xia Bingbing falling under his whim. At that very moment, she realized that they had been hugging each other this entire time. To be more precise, Huo Liancheng had his arms wrapped around her waist and pulling her up against his chest. It was then when she felt the sudden warmth of his skin up against hers, and she shivered. Her face flared bright red as she placed a hand on his chest. She tried to push him away, but each force was met with an even stronger resistance. Her eyes narrowed in irritation. However, just as she was going to push him one last time, she felt the elevator vibrate once more. Having not recovered from the drop, she had lost balance and toppled over, grabbing a hold of his coat. Soon enough, the elevator was going up once more. She held her breath as it did so, scared that it might crash once again. So many things had happened in a blink of an eye that she couldn't help but take a deep breath and look around. Once the danger had finally subsided, she stiffened and gazed up at him. "What are you?" "Oof." However, she didn't expect that he was going to lower his head. Immediately, their lips brushed and a surge of electricity shot through her system. Her hands froze and her back stiffened. Under the dim light, her eyes widened. Suddenly, the looming walls weren't on the top of her list of worries anymore, as she gazed into his dark eyes. Her mind had gone blank as a faint buzzing sound surrounded her eardrums. What the hell did she do? As the events had registered in her mind, Jin-Yoon quickly tried to push him away. However, as her hand was about to reach for his chest once again, he grabbed her wrist and pushed her up against the wall, trapping her indefinitely. His eyes glazed over, and heat crawled up her skin. The indifference was gone from his features, and instead, it was replaced with a far more heated stare, one that had made her heart skip a beat. What the hell was he trying to do? Jianyun's eyes were about to pop out of their sockets as she tried her best to struggle under his hold. While Liancheng was prying her fingers away, the elevator suddenly stopped. Noises came from outside as millions of footsteps crowded around the entrance. It was the rescue team. After the sound, a crack soon appeared on the door and light shot through. "President Wu? Are you okay?" Jinyun held her breath. They can't see this. Just having him take off her glasses was enough to put her face as the target of public criticism. What more if they caught her kissing their CEO? She might as well sign her resignation papers. She shouldn't have gone to work early today. C-17 will not accept him. "President Wu, are you okay?" Not hearing a reply, the rescuers asked again. Huo Liancheng's eyes were dark and deep. There was a certain glint in them, she realized as she was staring at him. It was as if he had been hiding many secrets within its depths. Before she could say anything else, he finally let go of her and stepped backward. Soon enough, the heat behind his gaze had disappeared, and it was soon replaced with total indifference. Just in time, the elevator doors had opened, a group of people crowded around the entrance. Various maintenance workers and security guards stood by each side, while a few of Ming's employees watched from behind, eyes wide in horror. The moment they saw Liancheng standing inside, they couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. However, dread soon followed, as they thought of what punishment might await them. Cheng Mu's was the only one unaffected by his intimidating aura. Instead, he stared back at him with a playful glint in his eyes. He had been so worried about the elevator door being forced open that he couldn't help but peek inside. He didn't expect to see such a provocative scene. It seemed that Fourth Bro finally made his move. He grinned at the thought, wondering how he was going to break the news to the group chat. After what had happened last night, Cheng Mu's was forced to accompany him back into the company once more, where he sat like a fool for 2 hours with the soybean milk in his hand. He had been waiting for Sister Jian to appear, where he would proceed to bump into her and create a chance for the two of them to talk. Although the elevator losing control was not part of his plan, it definitely gave them an opportunity to connect. Otherwise, Sister Jian wouldn't have been as willing to throw herself into his arms. The moment Huo Liancheng stepped out of the elevator, everyone rushed to his aid. Murmurs broke out of the crowd as they shot him question after question if he needed an ambulance. However, he ignored all of them, wearing a cold expression on his face. The mere sight of him made everyone wary. Jianyun stepped right out after him. Compared to the bustle surrounding her boss, her survival from the accident was met with silence and curiosity. As the crowd soon dispersed, there were only a few maintenance workers and Cheng Mu's standing by the elevator. "Sister Jian, are you okay? Were you scared?" He walked up to her, voice laced with concern. The maintenance workers couldn't help but be surprised by the sudden address. Cheng Muze had always been seen right next to the CEO. Why would he be so concerned over an ordinary employee? They shared looks before returning to their work. Although her face was pale, a flush of red remained in her cheeks. The events back at the elevator transpired in her mind, and she forced a smile into her lips. "I'm fine." She was nowhere near fine. Her legs were wobbly and her heart remained unsettled. How could she calm down? Not only had the elevator crashed, but Liancheng, their CEO, and one of the richest men in the city, had forcefully kissed her. The mere thought of his lips brushing up against hers made her blush even more. "Why don't you head home and get some rest for the day?" Cheng Luzi frowned. He had also assumed that Liancheng's sudden kiss must have caught her off guard. Thinking for a moment, she shook her head. "There's no need. I'm sure I'll be fine." Although she would have wanted to head back home and pretend as if nothing had happened, she didn't want this to affect her performance in the workplace. With Manager Xia shooting glares at her every second in the office, she wasn't going to let that woman find another reason to have her fired. "All right, but if you feel lightheaded, just tell me directly so I can give you a leave of absence." He clasped her shoulder. Just as he did, he felt a sharp gaze shooting through his back, and he immediately retracted his arm. Cheng Mu's placed his hands into his pockets and smiled. "This elevator is still under maintenance, so why don't you use our elevator instead?" Knowing fully well that he was talking about the exclusive elevator, she subconsciously glanced up at Liancheng, who was still surrounded by the crowd of security guards and executives. What she didn't expect was for him to look at her direction as well. As their gazes collided, she recoiled and lowered her head. Just then, a few executives from the higher management had received the news of the incident and rushed over. All of them had looks of concern for their CEO, but the man couldn't care less for them. Instead, he stared at Jian Yun's cowering figure, and his eyes narrowed even further. It's fine. Besides, the HR department is just a few floors up. I can take the stairs. She still had some lingering fear in her heart that she couldn't find it in herself to take another elevator. After she refused his offer, Jian Yun turned and walked towards the staircase. I'll go with you. Compared to Liancheng's icy demeanor, Sister Jian was obviously the better option to walk with. Without even glancing in Liancheng's direction, he quickly followed after her. The heels she had worn that day were quite high, and it wasn't appropriate for climbing the stairs. By the time she had climbed the second flight of stairs, Jian Yun was already out of breath. Even then, she continued, almost spraining her ankle a couple of times along the way. Sister Jian, what do you think about Mr. Huo? Chen Muzi used the opportunity to ask her. She had just taken off her coat from the heat when his words made her freeze. I mean, if Mr. Huo were to ask you out on a date, would you say yes? Deciding to drop all the formalities, he decided to be more direct with his line of questioning. At her hesitant look, he quickly promised, Don't worry, I won't say a thing to him. No, she later stated. Cheng Mu's couldn't hide his surprise. He blinked. Why? Doesn't he have everything? Rich, good physique, great personality. Being the sole heir of the Gu family, he was probably the best that one could get. A good personality? Jian Yun resisted the urge to snort. She may not have known the man well enough, but she knew for a fact that the said personality was ultimately non-existent. If he was truly so good-natured, would he have such a stoic face every time they meet? And with that sharp tongue of his, it was as if he was asking for a fight everywhere he went. Be honest, Sister Jian. If Mr. Huo likes you, would you like him back? Chen Muz asked again. It seemed that this situation was far more complicated than he had expected. Originally, he had assumed that if Liancheng would actively court her, it would be easy for her to fall for him. He didn't know that Sister Jian truly wasn't interested in him. This was bad. It's still a no. Do you have a boyfriend then? That was the only reason he could think of on why she'd refuse a man like Liancheng, but then again, it still didn't make any sense. If she had a boyfriend, why would she go on all of those blind dates? It's not that. Stopping what she was doing, she glanced out of the window and suppressed a sigh. He's a dangerous man to like. Besides, such a man would have tons of admirers flocking around him. So what if he was good-looking and had a good family? She had already suffered once and she wasn't going to allow herself to suffer again. He had fallen silent, not knowing how to respond to her. She was right. There were thousands of women who would follow Liancheng like a lapdog. Even if they knew they didn't have a chance with him, they still pursued him relentlessly. If he did have any woman in his arm, that woman would have to face tons of criticisms, which may be too much for her to handle. Brother Z, we're here. Seeing that he was still lost in his thoughts, she immediately pulled him up and waved him over. You don't need me to send you in? Cheng Muz smiled, satisfied that Jian Yun had finally addressed him the way he had wanted her to. When she shook her head, he nodded. All right, remember, if you're not feeling well, all you have to do is give me a call. And don't worry, I won't tell anyone about this. C18, because he was bad enough. Cheng Muz had stated that he wouldn't tell Liancheng of what they had talked about, but the moment he parted ways with Jian Yun, he turned around and went into the CEO's office. He smiled secretively. When Jian Yun had arrived at the personnel department, it was already way past office hours, and the department was very quiet. Just as she was about to bask in the peace, Xia Bingbing stepped out of the elevator with a sour look on her face. The moment she saw her, her face grew even bitter. I finally know why the Ming's group is getting worse by the year, she said snidely. It's because they're hiring stupid employees such as yourself. God, being late for work, you were probably thinking about how to hook up with men in the office, weren't you? Watch yourself. She simply glanced at the crazed woman, too lazy to even make eye contact. Her words of intimidation had no effect on her. Xia Bingbing may be their direct supervisor, but she had no right to fire her. Xia Bingbing had just arrived at the company when she heard that this shameless bitch had shared the same elevator as Liancheng. She had been so worried that she raced up into the 28th floor to see if he was injured, only for her to get kicked out of his office. There were many executives present during this time, so she had lost face even more. The more she looked at Jian Yun, the more she considered her as a threat. Manager Xia, is there anything else? She raised her eyebrows when she saw the woman aggressively blocking her door. If there's nothing else, then please get out of my way. I'll be heading to work. Seeing that she didn't move an inch, Jian Yun stepped aside and walked right past her, glancing at her manager's high-heeled stilettos. As she did, she couldn't help but curse under her breath. That woman truly was ambitious. At this point, she couldn't even understand why Liancheng would even close in on her. He already had a woman, as crazy as she may seem, and a child. Why the hell would he even be interested in her? Or could he just be another mindless rich playboy, out to notch another line in his bedpost? Stop. She had already stepped into her office when she heard Xia Bingbing's loud roar coming from behind her. Immediately, the woman made big strides forward before standing in front of her once more. Not forgetting the crazy scene that had happened back at the coffee shop the other night, she staggered back in alarm. She was not going to be a victim of the woman's tantrums again. And why would I do that? However, to her surprise, Xia Bingbing didn't say anything else. Instead, her manager's wide-eyed stare was fixated on her lips, and her face scrunched up in disbelief and shock. There were already a couple of people sticking their heads up their cubicles as they peered in her direction. After everything that had happened, she was 100% sure that various gossip may have circulated around the office, and she wasn't going to let this drama go any further. If there's nothing else, I'll be of. Before she could even finish her sentence, a hand appeared out of nowhere. A set of long nails brushed against Jianyun's lips, and she instinctively tilted her head back to avoid the blow. As she prepared herself for a slap in the face, Xia Bingbing examined the lipstick smudged across her nails and stomped out of the office as if she had gone mad. What the hell? Shaking her head, she walked over to her cubicle and sat down. As soon as she was seated, Wu Wenjing ran over to check on her. I heard that there had been an accident in the elevator this morning. Are you okay? I'm fine. What do you think was going to happen? She chuckled, turning on the computer. Seeing that her friend wasn't hurt, she breathed a sigh of relief. Even then, she couldn't help but lean over and ask about the newest gossip that the office had entertained itself with. I heard that you were trapped in the elevator with President Huo. I was? Not wanting to talk about him any further, she simply shrugged and turned away. The last thing she needed was to go on another round with Xia Bingbing. That's all you have to say? She shot her a glare before glancing at the other documents stacked on her desk. This really was the worst day to come early in the office. Not only was she late, but she had also gotten herself stuck in an elevator with none other than Huo Liancheng. If you're not aware, we're at work. Wait, your lipstick, why is it faded? Wu Wenning snapped out of her rant and stared at her friend's dark red lips as if she had discovered a clue. A sinister grin crossed her features as she propped onto the desk. Did you kiss anyone, She grabbed a mirror from the desk and showed it to her to prove a point. Does that someone happen to be President Huo? Shut it. Jian Yun pinched her. Although they had been whispering the entire time, it was hard to ensure that no one was eavesdropping on their conversation. Knowing her blabbering coworkers as well as her chattering friend, this news could only go haywire if any of them were to know or to even assume such a theory. She wasn't one to wear makeup often, but Ming's regulations had stated that every female employee must be presentable during business hours. That was why she had on a bit of blush and mascara. As she stared at her reflection, she could see the faded color of her lips and her face drained of all color. Fuck. Her mind automatically went to Xia Bingbing's strange behavior from earlier. She must have seen her lips and suspected that they had kissed back in the elevator. No. Her entire career was over before she had the time to even build it. What's wrong? Wu Wenjing frowned, noticing her friend's change in behavior. It seemed that her days at Ming's were numbered. Nothing. Jian Yun had originally thought that Xia Bingbing would march over to her desk and slap her right on the face after questioning Liancheng. However, more than an hour had already passed, and she still hadn't caught sight of Xia Bingbing. It was only till then did Wu Wenjing came up to her and whispered, "Guess what I heard today? That Xiao bitch had the nerve to go into the CEO's office this morning and made a complete ruckus. Not only did she scream at him, but she even attempted to remove her clothes and said how much he had betrayed her for fooling around with other women." Wu Wenjing slapped her knees as she struggled not to laugh. But get this, she was doing this while President Huo was in a meeting with all the higher executives. She still hadn't come back since. It seems that God's really on our side this time. Jian Yun raised her eyebrows upon hearing the explanation. Wait, you're serious? I got the news for Li Shangrong. He was one of the executives present during the meeting. She grinned. Wait, have the two of you finally made up? Course not. I even heard that he was getting friendly with another one of those trust fund rich girls. Her lips curled at the mention of her ex before changing the topic. Hey, didn't you say that manager Xia is pregnant with his child? Why would President Huo treat her like this? Isn't he afraid that she might have a miscarriage? Jian Yun shrugged. She had actually been thinking about this for quite some time, and upon seeing Xia Bingbing's behavior, she had gotten even more confused. What pregnant woman would continue wearing heavy makeup and high heels? Weren't those considered bad for the baby? They really were a weird pair. Maybe because he's just an asshole. Jian Yun rolled her eyes. That was the only explanation she could think of. He had continually played with women as if they were his pets, and he didn't want to be held responsible for any of them. The child must have just been another unwanted accident on his part. C-19, he's been looking for you. You always seem to have it at for President Huo ever since you met him. Wu Wenjing rolled her eyes, obviously not agreeing with her point of view. Cupping her hands around her chest, her eyes glazed at the mention of her crush. I mean, have you seen him? He could be a jerk, but at least he's a hot jerk. You're blinded. Jianyun shot her a middle finger. If you love him so much, why don't you just get up and marry him? You think I don't want to? Her eyes lit up from the sudden suggestion. She clasped her hands together and jumped up from her seat. That man is probably on the top of everyone's wish list. I bet even the cleaning lady wants to get a hold of him, and she's already in her late 50s. I'd do anything to make him mine. She blinked, surprised. Didn't you say you were afraid of him back then? I am, but if you give me a chance to spend a night with him, I'd take it even if it means I'll freeze to death. Wu Wenjing waved her fists up in the air to emphasize her longing for the man. They were lucky that Xia Bingbing was nowhere to be seen, or else she might kick them both out of their offices. Whatever. Just leave me alone. Not bearing to hear her friend praise Huo Liancheng any longer, she pushed her away and focused on her work. It was still a very long day ahead, and she'd prefer it if she'd never see or even hear of that man again. Last night, Auntie Chin had informed her that Lin Rong had come looking for her mother again. Luckily, Mrs. Jian was at the hospital, so they didn't have the chance to meet again. However, she doubted that this would be the last time that woman would come knocking on their doorsteps. Then came this morning where she had not only encountered an elevator accident, but was also forcefully kissed by the company's CEO. Even the thought made her head hurt. Throughout the entire day, Jianyun found herself absent-mindedly typing into her computer. Her forehead was aching that she didn't even notice the obvious errors that were peppered across the document. After her morning's work was finished, she didn't even force herself to continue any longer. Instead, she grabbed her coat and prepared to return home and rest there instead. Since Xia Bingbing wasn't here, Jianyun didn't need to ask for a leave of absence. Instead, she directly informed Wu Wenjing that if their manager had returned, to say that her absence was approved by Chen Mu's himself. Without another word, she wore her coat and walked right out of the office. The November weather was definitely harsh, especially today, with no sun or bright skies to combat the overbearing winds. As Jianyun stood near the bus stop, she couldn't help but glance around. Although she was surrounded by hundreds of people, she still felt completely alone in facing the world. Ever since she found out the truth 6 years ago, it was as if she had immediately grown up. All those years, she had worked and studied hard just to keep herself from feeling the emptiness in her heart. Although she was only 26, her heart had already felt enough pain to last her a century. The bus didn't arrive for a long time, and she could feel her nose turn red from the biting winds. She glanced at her wristwatch. At this rate, she might have better luck in catching the subway instead. Just then, she noticed that someone was standing in front of her, gazing curiously at her pale face. She raised her head, only to see the man blink in surprise. You're Jianyun, aren't you? She hesitated. And you are? Don't you remember me? The man's eyes shone excitedly. I'm also from Qing University. I shared the same dorm with Xu Haiyang, remember? You always come to our dorm to hang out with us. Her heart skipped a beat at the mention of her ex's name, but Jianyun quickly concealed the hurt in her eyes. Gazing at the man in front of her, a memory flashed back in her mind. Wait, you're Chen? Right, Chen Da. I didn't expect you to even remember me. His face brightened up at the thought of being recognized. Even then, there was still a trace of shyness in his features. I've become quite a man now, haven't I? I mean, it's normal for you to not recognize me. I did lose a lot of weight from the time I've been studying back at uni. She chuckled. Chen Da was a chubby student with a hilarious personality. They'd usually chat and tease each other back when she and Xu Haiyang were still together. They'd always gotten along quite well, but after graduation, they've lost touch. So, why are you here? I work at Ming's, she replied. What a coincidence. I just came back from overseas and submitted my application for Ming's a week ago. Chen Da grinned, running a hand through his hair. There was a hint of amazement in his eyes before he looked away. Perhaps we'll be colleagues. It's been a long time since we last saw each other. You've grown more beautiful, Yun. When the bus had finally arrived, Jianyun shot him a smile. The bus has arrived. I guess I should get going. Wait, hey, do you mind leaving me your number? Next time. Chen Da clicked his fingers, as if the thought had just occurred to him. Xu Haiyang also came back. Says that he's looking for you. Did you know that? Jianyun had already stepped on the bus when he had said those words. Immediately, her mind had gone blank, and her heart stopped. It was as if her entire world had frozen all around her, but she continued on like he hadn't said a thing. There weren't many people on the bus, so she quickly found a seat in the back row. As the bus drove farther and farther away from the stop, his words continued to echo at the back of her mind. Sweat beaded down her palms. Xu Haiyang was looking for her? Bullshit! It had been 6 years when he had left, and his words coursed through her veins like poison. It was so long, yet the pain was still fresh. A cold smile slid into her lips. Just then, her phone vibrated. When she took it out, her eyes widened and she froze. Huo Liancheng had just added her on WeChat. Jianyun stared blankly at the 3 words that had popped on her screen. Should she add him? Should she not? Shu Haiyang had faded to the back of her mind as she stared at Lian Cheng's profile picture. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Was he serious? Was this real? Could this be a scam? Conflicted, Jinyun decided to ignore him and shove the phone back into her bag. Maybe he committed a mistake, or maybe it wasn't him. Either way, it was inappropriate to accept a friend request from her boss, right? However, Huo Liancheng was obviously not the kind of man to wait passively. 5 minutes later, she noticed her phone started to ring. Glancing at the caller ID, she suppressed a groan. Now, Jian Yun was faced with another problem to answer or leave it be. Her phone kept on ringing, that she started to attract more attention from the other passengers. Burying herself into the seat to avoid their judgmental looks, she finally picked it up. President Huo. Jian Yun whispered. There was silence on the other end of the line. Just as she was about to hang up, he responded. You've already gone home? Yeah, I wasn't feeling very well. Have you seen my message on WeChat? He asked again. There were sounds of scrawling from the other end of the line. He must be signing a document. Surprised, Jian Yun leaned against her seat, not daring to say that she had ignored it. I'm on the bus, so I haven't checked my phone yet. She later replied after a few seconds of hesitation. Check it now. Before she could say anything else, he hung up the phone. Chapter 20. Luo Yanyan's pain. Jian Yun stared helplessly as she stared at his profile picture. At this point, she couldn't even pretend that she hadn't seen the friend request yet. It's not as if she could reject him either, given that he had just called. After hesitating for a bit, she heaved a sigh and accepted Lian Cheng's friend request. She had initially thought that he'd try and talk to her, but even after she had gotten off the bus, he still hadn't sent her a message. It was better off this way. Besides, it wasn't as if she had anything to talk about with him. The moment she returned home, she headed straight to her bedroom and took off her clothes. Once her head hit the pillow, Jian Yun ultimately blacked out for the next few hours. If it hadn't for the sound of a phone ringing, she would have slept through the night. At first, Jian Yun had assumed that it was her phone that had been ringing this entire time. As she glanced at the black screen, she heard Luo Yanyan's voice echoing across the apartment. She figured out it was hers and buried herself under the covers once more. However, her friend's voice had grown louder and louder, and Jian Yun's drowsiness had soon drifted away. She scrambled up from her bed and put on her clothes. Oh well, it was probably for the best. Besides, she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Glancing at the dark skies, she slowly stood up. Suddenly, just as she was about to reach for the doorhandle, she heard Luo Yanyan sobs and paused. Maybe this wasn't the right time to interrupt them. Mom, are you trying to work me to death? She sounded very agitated. I already said that I don't have any money. I've given you a month's worth of salary, so what else do you want? Luo Yanyan had turned on the loudspeaker mode, so Jian Yun could also hear Mrs. Luo's harsh words. I didn't raise you to be so heartless, she spat. Do you know how much we've spent on you? Hundreds of thousands of yuan just to send you to your graduate studies? Have you forgotten that? Are you turning your back on your family? Haven't already paid you back? At this point, her friend was already screaming her heart out. All the excess money I have earned, I gave to you. And when I've already gotten a job, you took all my salary away. What else do you want? So you're saying you've earned only 3,000 yuan a month? What's the point of earning your graduate studies if your salary's worth nothing? Just 3,000. Just 3,000? Mom, that's my entire salary. Her voice trembled, and Jian Yun could hear a crash coming from the living room as her friend collapsed onto the cold tiles. I've worked so hard and I can't even use the money that I've earned. Don't you see how wrong this is? Oh please, you think I'm accepting any of your bullshit? Mrs. Luo snorted. You think I don't know of your freelancing business? Your salary's way more than this. Having enough, Luo Yanyan screamed and slammed her phone onto the counter. Not being able to stand it any longer, Jian Yun stepped out of the room. Luo Yanyan might be embarrassed, but she knew for a fact that her friend needed someone to be there for her. Besides, they had already known each other for around 9 years. From being college classmates to roommates, they had been there for most of their embarrassing moments, as well as their heartbreaking ones. Yanyan. She slowly pulled her friend up from the tiles and hugged her. Yun, why aren't you at work? Her eyes widened momentarily at the sight, but she didn't push her away. Instead, Luo Yanyan rested on her shoulder, shaking from the fight she just had. This was the first time the mother and daughter duo had ever raised their voices at each other, and the impact had been hard on both of them. Jian Yun grabbed a few tissue papers from the box before handing it to her. I felt unwell, so I went home for the day, she briefly explained, leaving out the events that had truly transpired in the office. You probably heard everything, huh? Luo Yanyan choked out, wiping the tears rolling down her cheeks. After a moment's hesitation, she sighed and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. I know that it isn't my place, but you shouldn't spoil them too much. They're your parents, but they still shouldn't be such a burden to you. I know. Nodding furiously, she bent over to cover her face. But it's not like I can do anything. They're my parents, and if I just ignore them, I'd... Money doesn't fall from the sky. Even if they're in debt, they can't always rely on you. Besides, they don't ask for money because they need it, it's because they want it. Have you seen the house they bought for your little brother? She sighed. It's time that you live your own life. Spread your wings a little. Do they think they can still take your money like this once you're married? I want to refuse them, but every time I try to. She stuttered as the tears continually fell down her cheeks. Luo Yanyan crumbled into her arms as she sobbed. My father had just been framed, and my mom, her health is declining, and my brother, he doesn't have a stable job. If I don't take care of their expenses, who knows what they'd do? Who knows what I'd do? Yanyan, if you keep this up, they'd never stop. Jianyun knew that Mr. and Mrs. Luo had been strict with her ever since she was young. For them, Luo Yanyan was like an exquisite flower that they were so desperate in keeping, and it was no secret that she was as kind as an angel. Despite knowing of her parents' endless desires, she still couldn't refuse them. Even then, Jianyun couldn't really judge her as she knew what it was like to be in her shoes. After all, it had been 6 years since the incident, and her own mother had been living in constant pain every day. Despite knowing how upset it made her feel, she couldn't totally abandon her. There was just so much that a child could do. Perhaps this was what they meant by the phrase, blood is thicker than water. Wanting to cheer her up, Jianyun invited her out to dinner. Although Luo Yanyan had finally calmed down, she remained silent this entire time. Even then, it still didn't matter. After all, their presence was enough to sustain both their troubles. It was already 8 o'clock when they had finally gotten back home. Luo Yanyan leaned against her arms and murmured, Can I pay you back next month? I'll have to fix up another payroll draft, and It's fine, we can talk about this some other time. Jianyun waved her hand dismissively. Although she wasn't rich, she knew that her friend needed the cash more than she did. Plus, she had already saved enough for herself. Luo Yanyan poured 2 cups of hot water. Passing one to her, she slowly sat down. Right, how's your mother? Have you already raised enough for the operation? The operation's done. She's still recovering, but as of now, there's still no progress. Jianyun sighed, rubbing the creases on her forehead. Just the thought of her mother sent a pang through her heart. I thought about taking her to the capital for a while, but we're still waiting for a doctor to give the go signal. There was silence between them when her friend hesitated. Yun, there's actually something I want to tell you. What is it? Shu Haiyan called me the other day to ask about your situation. Jianyun was placing her cup onto the table when she heard the news. Immediately, her hands started to tremble. She had almost lost grip of the cup if she hadn't steadied herself. Her eyes had grown cold, as if the mere thought of the man had brought forth all the bitterness in her heart. What about my situation? If you're single? But don't worry, I didn't say anything. Luo Yanyan added quickly. Jianyun remained impassive. I actually wanted to ask you about this. There was a short pause before Luo Yanyan continued. If Shu Haiyang still loves you and chases after you, would you ever find it in yourself to forgive him? Love? Find it in me? Jianyun stared mockingly at her. I've already had the first glimpse of his love, and let me tell you this, it's as worthless as a bag of garbage. Time may have passed, but he still couldn't take back what he had said that day, what he had done to me. After answering her, she excused herself and headed back into her bedroom. There, Jianyun stared at the ceiling as the moonlight reflected her pale complexion. Her mind had gone blank as she tried to register everything that had happened. Cheng Muze had just asked her if she'd accept Lian Cheng if ever he would court her. And now, Luo Yanyan's asking her if she would ever forgive Shu Haiyan if ever he still loved her. Why were there so many what-ifs in this world?